Hello everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be a non-spoiler review of Dune. This is the second live-action cinematic adaptation of the classic sci-fi series of novels by Frank Herbert from the 1960s. Released first internationally in certain markets on September the 3rd, 2021, and then shortly in October the 22nd, 2021 in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Dune stars Timothy Chalamet in the lead role, Zendaya, Josh Brolin, Oscar Isaac, Rebecca Ferguson, Dave Batistua, Xavier Bardem, and it was directed by Denis Vlienueve. Now, Dune is also due to be released simultaneously on HBO Max. Now, the setup of Dune is that we are set in a way distant future, a very dystopian landscape, somewhere within the year of 10,191. And we focus on the people known as the Freemen within the desert landscape of the planet Arrakis. And now the planet Arrakis has constantly been attacked by the Hurricane because the planet contains a highly valuable substance known as the Splice. The Splice is sought after by many factions throughout the galaxy because it can extend human life, give superhuman powers, and even provide interstellar space travel. Now we go to the planet Caladian, where the Duke of Aratis has been assigned by the Emperor to govern and protect the planet Arrakis from all of the upheaval and also manage the substance of the Splice. Now, the Duke takes his son, Paul Aratis, alongside him, who we find out over the course of the story has a far bigger importance and relevance in terms of the future state of the universe. Now, there's been a lot of hype and expectation about Dune. It's been seen by so many as a big return to the more serious, concept-driven sci-fi movie, almost as a counterpoint to the dominance of the superhero movies that we've seen in the current climate today. Now, overall, this is a film that very much captures the aesthetics of a serious sci-fi epic in terms of all of the visual shots and musical score, but when you dig deeper beneath the surface of those aesthetics, the movie to me is very lacking in terms of a compelling story, and whilst it's never complicated, the story itself never feels essential and gets really lost in the overindulgence of all of the visuals. Now, on the positive side, director Denis Vlienueve has infused an impressive look and scale to this movie. We get multiple shots and sequences of deserts and mountains and skylines. Lots of tracking shots looming overhead in terms of the environment of the planet. We get plenty of dream sequences and montages throughout the film, and at various times it does immerse you into this world that Denis Vlienueve is building. It's very expansive, and a lot of fans of the original source material will be very pleased that this adaptation has been taken very seriously, especially with the movie's budget, which I believe ranged from anything from around 165 to 180 million. Now, the visuals are complemented very well by Hans Zimmer's musical score. Yes, we do get those typical booming horns and wailing voices that have been very typical of his most recent work, but I think enough of his music does support the film very well. We get very much of those synthesized, almost droning tones and weightier themes, which actually helps the movie a lot, especially in its first quarter. All of the actors involved perform their roles for the most part very well. The movie itself has a well-assembled quality cast of actors here, but to be honest, they all haven't been utilised as well as what I thought they should have been. Now, my particular standouts in terms of the cast are Jason Momoa as Duncan Idaho. He's the more typical strong warrior. He's a very good friend and companion to Paul, and he has much more of that typical confidence and bravado. I did indeed very much like the earlier scenes between him and Paul, and they showcased a bit more of levity and camaraderie, and to be honest, the film could have done with a few more of these moments as it progressed throughout the second half of its story. Oscar Isaac as Paul's father brings much more gravitas and nobility to his role as the main leader of the Aratis. He fully appreciates the priority of attaining and managing the Splice substance, but at the same time he doesn't want to claim the millions of the Fremen people, and is still very much considerate in terms of their overall lives and existence within the planet. Rebecca Ferguson as Paul's mother, Beanie, was easily the most prominent supporting character throughout the whole entire movie, and I think she performs her role very well, bringing a lot more of the emotional weight, in particular her relationship with Paul, and I think that was very good in just keeping you engaged with certain characters throughout the main part of this movie. Now, we had a whole host of other actors, the likes of Javier Bardem, Josh Brolin, Dave Batistua, but all of which have a very limited role throughout this film. Now, they do good of the screen time that they get, but they don't really turn out to be much more substantial characters, and I just wonder, had their roles been expanded throughout this whole movie, it may have made it a far more compelling experience. We look at Zendaya especially, who, following her roles in the MCU Spider-Man films, was probably brought in this movie to attract younger audiences, and to be honest, it's a bit false advertising from the trailers because she's barely in this film without spoiling it, and really her character here is much more of a setup as to what may happen in any future sequels that we may get surrounding Dune. And it really is in this department of trying to set up for future installments where I think the film runs into certain problems. Now, this movie adaptation was always planned to be a two-parter, and that's very much noted in the opening titles. And this film, for all of the visuals that we see on screen, feels very incomplete and very inessential when you get to the end part of the story. The film's pace is quite slow to begin with, and it really drags us free, especially in the opening quarter. And for all of the talk about Dune in terms of the source material and how it's a very dense and very complicated property in terms of all of the various concepts and ideals that we see throughout, it's very much been deemed the science fiction Game of Thrones. But when we look at this film's plot, it's very basic overall, and that they probably watered down the overall complexities of the story to try and appeal to more non-fans and general audiences. As I've mentioned in my previous coverage, Dune is very much of a niche science fiction art house concept. It doesn't have the very much broader strokes as what we see particularly with Star Wars and Star Trek, where you're dealing with very iconic characters. But in terms of this film, the film's outline is very prolonged. It almost feels like the director is far more interested in further parts of the novels, but he was almost obliged to begin at this stage overall. And I also have a very cynical feeling that Denis Vlienueve wanted indeed to tell future installments, but he was only given a set runtime in his overall project. And when he was taking on the origin part of Dune, he probably had around about an hour and a half worth of material, but probably fearing that he may never get to make a sequel, I really felt that he's stretched this material out into what we got was basically a 2.5 hour movie. This is very much indicated a lot with the various visions and dreams that we see Paul having throughout the movie, which almost act as mini advertisements as to what will happen in any potential future installments. But these elements, which are very interesting and potentially very compelling, are never really arrived at throughout the film. And it feels very frustrating that we don't see these more interesting parts of the story fully utilised, particularly when you reach the film's ending, which is very abrupt and ends on such a flat climax in many sense, that at the end of the film you have a resigned expression and feeling. And I almost wish that the film had rushed quicker through what it had showed us in order to get to the more promising elements that it very much teases to show us later on. Now, we do get hints of certain factions and political statements and betrayal in the beginning part of the film, but as we get into the second part, it really is much more of an elongated chase. Now, we do get certain action scenes and spectacle, and those are handled very well. The action is very coherent throughout the most part of the film, and a lot of the fight choreography was very good. I did enjoy the earlier training sequence between Josh Brolin and Timothy Chalamet, and also where we have an assault later on in terms of the clan of Artidis when they're on the planet Arrakis. These are very well executed sequences. Another major reason why the film is less urgent in terms of its storytelling despite all of the spectacle on screen is because, in my opinion, there is just a sheer overindulgence from the director in terms of the visuals. Now, Denis Vlienueve for me is a clear visual stylist. When we look at his films Blade Runner 2049 and Arrival and Sicario, and overall, in terms of the movie's aesthetics, I do believe Vlienueve is a very sophisticated and composed filmmaker, but his overindulgence on the film's visuals very much comes at the story's expense. So many times throughout the film we get so many prolonged sequences of people walking in the desert in slow motion, looking at the sky in slow motion, having dreams or visions in slow motions. So many long shots of ships descending down in the sky amongst the synthesized music and the tracking shots of all of the various backgrounds. All of this is done in slow motion, and it just drains so much energy throughout the overall narrative. And this film really just gets caught up in itself, and it almost feels as if the film is almost admiring how visually pleasing it looks. Almost as if it's much more of a cinematography showcase rather than a compelling story. Now, along with the very loud, at times wailing vocals throughout the soundtrack, it's quite amazing how similar Villeneuve is to Zack Snyder in really embracing far more of the visualization of something that he really loses any personal connection in terms of the overall story and its characters. If I had no knowledge of who the director was and you watched this film and you told me it was a Zack Snyder movie, I probably would have believed you, just because Villeneuve shows so much of the same traits in terms of the movie aesthetics of what we see throughout Snyder's own filmography. Now, in terms of a lack of a personal connection, we really have to talk about the lead character, Paul himself. Now, in terms of the character, it's very much of the typical traits that we see in these type of movies: the chosen one, the anointed savior, the prophesied deliverer. We've seen this type of character trait so many times throughout multiple movies when we look at the Star Wars films, the Matrix films, and of course the Lord of the Rings. And the movie goes to great lengths to emphasise how important Paul is, but it's all done at exposition level, so you never feel the weight of how important Paul really is to the overall story. For me, he's just really a functional lead. He's just there to be the centre of the story. He acts certain ways, he has certain visions, he gets involved in certain fights, in certain running sequences, but he doesn't really have any sort of distinguishable charm or charisma or personality. Even a climactic act, which is meant to really cement the pivotal status of the character, it's really just such an underwhelming encounter that never makes you truly convinced that Paul is indeed the ultimate saviour throughout this story. And to be fair, it's nothing against Timothy Chalamet, as he's only really playing the role that he's written, but I just have to be honest and say, as the main protagonist of the film, Paul is sadly too bland and just not very interesting as a character. So if I had to give a score for Dune, I would give it a 5.9 out of 10. We have great visuals, great musical score, and there's a real epic scope and immersiveness about this film. But it really does lack a compelling narrative, and the director very much overindulges in terms of his overall aesthetics and the certain cinematography within the film. And sadly, we have a very bland lead character, and also we have a very frustrating so what ending. When I look at this film overall, I really think it should have been trimmed down to 2 hours maximum. And I do know there's been a lot of hope for Dune to get a two-parter. Now, that may not happen because of the simultaneous day and date streaming with HBO Max, which I still think was a major mistake from Warner Brothers. But if you wanted to take a far more prolonged approach with Dune, and you really wanted to utilise a lot more of the huge depth in terms of its storytelling, I truly believe that this would have been far more suited as a HBO Max miniseries. As many people have hyped this up to potentially be the next Game of Thrones in terms of science fiction, it would have had a far better chance if it had 6 to 8 episodes dedicated to each individual seasons, when it really could have tapped much more into the bigger themes and elements within the Dune source material, and also given us far more chance to expand much more on the characters and inject far more personality within the lead character overall. So will Dune end up being a big return to the intelligent, more concept-driven sci-fi, big-budget blockbuster? I'm not so sure. In fact, I'm not so sure that it indeed has much depth in terms of its concept or ideals, and this may very much be at odds for the more hardcore Dune fans who very much are into the franchise because of the deeper themes and concepts driven. But as stated before, they may be very pleased at the fact that they are getting a big budget adaptation of the film. Those are my overall thoughts and feelings and non-spoiler review of Dune. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I will also provide a spoiler review shortly after this video is uploaded, where I'll go into far more depth as to the elements that I felt worked within the movie and the elements that I felt didn't work as well within the film overall. So be sure to look out for that video very shortly. Please also hit and like those subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.